In March of 1971, the soil in Cimarron County, Oklahoma still smelled the way it had smelled for 30 years, of alkali and old defeat. The smell was faint and bitter, the way certain kinds of failure become part of the air. Walter Briggs stood at the north edge of his inherited 340 acres and pressed the toe of his work boot against the ground. The surface did not give. It cracked instead in thin white lines, the way old ceramic breaks when you set it down too hard. Walter was 62 years old. He had farmed the 60 acres next to this land for 31 years. The 60 acres his father had carved out of the good-sided ground before the alkaline hardpan took the rest. He knew what productive soil felt like underfoot, the slight give, the smell of fungal activity after light rain, the way earthworms surfaced toward your footfall. This ground had none of that. It had not grown a commercial crop since 1931. Every morning, without variation, Walter walked the perimeter of his own 60 acres before breakfast. He examined the soil by pinching it between thumb and forefinger and releasing. He read drainage patterns from the crusted surface after any rainfall. He had done this since 1940, the year his father handed him the task at age 9, and told him a man who does not know his ground cannot grow anything on it worth keeping. His father, Clarence Briggs, had died in January of that year. He left Walter the good 60 acres, a 1948 Allis-Chalmers WD tractor, a corrugated iron equipment shed, and the 340 acres of alkaline waste that no one in the county had been able to cultivate since the last of the topsoil blew east in the droughts of the 1930s. What Walter did not know yet, standing in the cold March air with the cracked ground under his boot, was that what his father had really left him was in the equipment shed. And it would take him 3 more days to find it. If you've never heard this story before, subscribe now. You'll want to see how it ends. The county extension meeting at the Boise City Fairgrounds happened on the 14th of April, 1971. 43 farmers attended. Dr. Marcus Cole, the regional director of the Oklahoma State University Cooperative Extension Service, stood at the front of the room with a pointer and a laminated soil survey map of Cimarron County. He had been at his post for 11 years. He wore a blazer in a room of men in denim. He spoke with the precision of someone who had been correct in public many times and found it comfortable. When the subject of the Briggs parcel came up, a neighboring landowner raised it, suggesting that the county might provide some kind of assistance if a new owner attempted rehabilitation. Dr. Cole located the parcel on his map with the pointer and held it there. The soil profile on the Briggs 340 is documented, he said. High sodium accumulation, pH between 9.2 and 9.6, in the upper 18 inches. Calcium carbonate hardpan at 22 inches. This is not marginal land. This is land that has exceeded its agricultural capacity. He paused. If someone wants to run goats on it, that's their business. But we are not in the business of encouraging people to spend money they don't have on ground that cannot respond. Somebody toward the back of the room said, Briggs inherited it. There was some movement in the chairs. Cole did not change expression. Then Mr. Briggs inherited a tax liability, he said. 2 men in the second row laughed, the easy laugh of people who agree without needing to think about it. Walter was seated in the 4th row. He said nothing. He did not shift in his chair. He listened to Cole explain the county's soil rehabilitation pilot program, which required a minimum pH of 7.8 for enrollment and a soil organic matter content of at least 1.2%. The Briggs parcel did not qualify on either measure. Cole explained this the way a doctor explains a blood result. It was not cruelty. It was the confidence of a man holding better information than the room. After the meeting, outside in the gravel lot, Glenn Purdy, who farmed 800 acres 2 miles north and had been farming them since 1955, stopped beside Walter at the truck. "You going to do something with it?" Purdy said. It was not quite a question. "Probably," Walter said. Purdy looked at the ground, then at the sky, in the way men in that county looked at things they had already decided about. "Marcus knows his soil science," he said. Walter got in his truck. The notebook was in a tin box on the second shelf of the equipment shed, behind a coffee can of grease fittings. It was a standard composition notebook, black and white, the kind sold at the drugstore in Boise City for 35 cents. Clarence had used 11 of them over his lifetime. Walter had seen most of them. He had not seen this one. The first entry was dated August 14, 1938. The last was dated October 3, 1970, 3 months before Clarence died. It took Walter 4 evenings to read it. He sat at the kitchen table after dinner with a cup of coffee and his reading glasses, and he went through it the way a man goes through a thing he does not fully understand, but knows he must not rush. His wife Ruth washed dishes and then sat with her mending and said nothing. She had been watching Walter read for 33 years. She knew when to leave a room alone. What Clarence had recorded across 32 years of observation was this: the 340 acres was not dead ground. It was thirsty ground. Specifically, it was ground above a deep subsoil moisture reservoir, a clay lens at 36 inches that held lateral water movement from the Canadian River, drainage 50 miles east. Clarence had found it in 1938 by driving a soil probe to 42 inches at 16 locations across the parcel, recording the moisture readings, and mapping them on the back pages of the notebook in pencil. He had updated this map 11 times over 30 years. The reservoir was consistent. It had never gone dry. The second thing the notebook contained was a record of a conversation Clarence had in 1952 with an Australian engineer named P.A. Yeomans, who had presented at an agricultural conference in Amarillo. Yeomans had described a method of subsoil plowing on precise contour lines, not the straight rows of conventional tillage, but curved lines calculated to distribute water laterally across a slope rather than letting it run off. The technique moved moisture from where the subsoil held it toward the root zone of surface crops. Conventional depripping broke the hardpan but ignored the movement of water through it. Yeoman's method used the hardpan as a floor and worked with the topography to spread water evenly. Clarence had spent the winter of 1952 fabricating a subsoil plow from 2 sections of 90-pound railroad rail, salvaged from an abandoned Santa Fe spur near Keys. He had welded the shanks to a modified 3-point hitch frame and hardened the tips in the forge behind the shed. The plow drove a single shank to 18 inches without inverting the soil profile. He had tested it on 4 acres of the 340 in the spring of 1953 and recorded the result in the notebook. Soil moisture at 8 inches increased by 31% over adjacent untreated ground after one moderate rain event. He had not continued the experiment. He was 61 years old that spring, and farming 60 acres alone, and there was not enough of him left over. The last entry in the notebook read, "The contour lines are already marked in the fence posts along the north boundary, red paint, spaced at 30-foot intervals. I put them there in 1967. Walter will know what they mean if he reads this." Walter drove to the north fence the following morning before breakfast. He counted 17 red-painted posts, each one placed where the ground broke to a new contour elevation. He stood in the cold and looked at them for a long time. The problem everyone else had seen as a dead end, Clarence had spent 32 years mapping as an entrance. Walter began in September of 1971. He did not tell anyone what he was doing or why. He pulled the old Allie's Chalmers WD out of the shed and checked it the way Clarence had taught him: oil, fuel lines, cooling fins, all 4 implement attachment points. The tractor had 4,200 hours on it and ran without complaint. Clarence had greased the subsoil plow's pivot bearings on the first Sunday of every month since he built it in 1952. The bearings were clean. The shanks were sound. Walter drove the tractor to the north fence and set the plow shank to 17 inches. He aligned the first run with the topmost painted fence post and drove south along the contour, feeling the machine lean and correct as the ground changed beneath him. The shank fractured the hardpan layer at the 18-inch mark without lifting the soil above it. Behind the tractor, the disturbed subsoil closed over and left a surface that looked, to anyone watching from the road, exactly like undisturbed ground. Glenn Purdy drove past on the county road on the second day and slowed his pickup to watch. He watched for several minutes and drove on. He said nothing until the following Saturday at the Boise City feed store, where he told 2 other farmers that Walter Briggs was disking the alkaline ground with an implement nobody had seen before, which looked like it was doing nothing visible. "He's busting hardpan at depth," one of the men said. "Won't change the pH," the other said. "No," Purdy agreed. "It won't." Walter finished the first pass contour runs on October 8th. 81 passes at 30-foot spacing across the northern 120 acres, each one following the precise contour line Clarence had marked. He then broadcast winter wheat seed at 22 pounds per acre across the disturbed surface and covered it with a single light pass of a chain harrow. He also broadcast hairy vetch at 4 pounds per acre mixed into the wheat, on Clarence's note from 1964 that legumes in the wheat stand would begin fixing nitrogen into a soil that had almost none. He left it. The winter of 1971 to 1972 was dry. The wheat germinated poorly, with stand counts running about 40% of optimal across most of the 120 acres. Walter walked the ground in January and counted tillers, and said nothing to anyone. He noted the stand count in his own notebook, a plain spiral-bound tablet he had started the day he finished reading Clarence's. In February, he noticed something. Along the contour plow lines, the wheat stand ran to 65%. Off the lines, it dropped back to 35%. He measured the soil moisture at 8 inches with a hand probe at 12 locations. On the contour lines, the moisture reading averaged 18.4%. Off the lines, 11.2%. The subsoil was moving laterally, as Clarence had said it would. He noted the date, the measurements, and the locations. He did not alter his pace. He started the tractor on the first Sunday of February and greased the subsoil plow bearings and drove the tractor back into the shed. In the spring of 1972, Walter planted the second of the 340 acres 3 sections, the middle 110 acres, in the same pattern. Contour runs at 17 inches, 30-foot spacing. Hairy vetch intercropped with dryland sorghum at 9 pounds per acre. It was during this stretch that Glenn Purdy stopped on the county road a second time. This time he got out of the truck and walked to the fence line and called out to Walter, who was 60 yards off, walking back from checking a plow run. "How's it looking?" Purdy said. "Working," Walter said. Purdy looked at the field. The winter wheat from the previous fall was standing at about half its potential yield. Thin, pale green, not the dense stands that the good ground to the north produced. It looked like a struggling crop. From the road it looked like exactly what Cole had predicted. "Marcus is running a workshop in August," Purdy said. "Soil amendment techniques, gypsum applications for sodic soils, might be worth attending." "I'll think about it," Walter said. He had already decided not to attend. Gypsum applications on 340 acres at the recommended rate of 4 tons per acre would cost more than the land's assessed value. That August, the rains came late and short. The sorghum on the middle 110 set heads, but the grain filled poorly. Walter harvested what there was, about 14% of what a good ground sorghum crop would have returned. He plowed the residue back in. The hairy vetch had fixed an estimated 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre into the soil over the growing season. He could not measure this directly. He could measure the earthworm count in the top 6 inches at the plow line locations. In September of 1971, he had counted 2 earthworms per cubic foot. In September of 1972, on the treated 120 acres, he counted 11 per cubic foot. The organisms were returning to ground that had held none for 40 years. He noted this and kept going. The complication arrived in June of 1973 in the form of a rainfall event that the National Weather Service recorded as 4.7 inches in 90 minutes, a cloudburst of the kind that hit the Oklahoma Panhandle without warning and left in the same way. Walter was in town when it hit. He drove back on roads that were already running with orange-brown water. When he reached his property and turned toward the 340, he stopped the truck and got out. The north 120 acres, the first section he had treated, now in its second year of recovery, had taken the rain differently than he had feared and differently than he had hoped. The water had run along the contour lines as planned, spreading laterally across the slope rather than channeling into erosion gullies. But the force of 4.7 inches in 90 minutes had been more than the recovering surface could absorb. 2 of the contour plow runs had captured standing water that had nowhere to go. A low point in the northern section had pooled to a depth of about 8 inches across nearly 3 acres. The standing water sat for 6 days. When it receded, those 3 acres were covered in a white crust, sodium salts drawn up from the wet subsoil, and left on the surface as the water evaporated. It was the precise mechanism that had poisoned the original ground in the first place. Walter stood at the edge of the white crust on the seventh day after the storm. He did not speak. He walked the boundary of the affected area and measured it with a hip chain at 2.8 acres. He noted the location. He drove to the Boise City Library the following week and spent 2 afternoons reading through bound issues of the Journal of Soil Science from 1958 through 1968. He was looking for a specific paper Clarence had referenced in the notebook, a 1961 study on salt accumulation patterns in sodic soils following ponding events. He found it. The paper noted that sodium accumulation after temporary ponding was reversible under a sustained leaching regime, provided the drainage path was established first. The drainage path was the thing. The contour plow runs were distributing water horizontally, but had no outlet for water that accumulated beyond absorption capacity. He needed a single deep drain, a keyline outlet, running off the northwest corner of the property at the natural low point. In July of 1973, Walter hand-dug a 340-foot drain channel along the northwest property boundary, 2 feet wide and 14 inches deep. It took him 19 days, working 2 hours before sunrise and 2 hours after sunset to avoid the heat. Ruth brought water out at midday and set it on the fence post and walked back to the house. He seeded the drain channel margins with buffalo grass for stabilization and waited for rain. The next significant rainfall, 2.1 inches over 4 hours in September, ran along the contour lines, accumulated briefly at the low points, and drained northwest without ponding. The affected 2.8 acres received leaching water that moved through and out. Within 6 weeks, the white sodium crust had thinned. By the following spring, it was gone. No one saw this except Walter and one other person, Ruth, who had walked the northern section on her own one morning in October and stood at the place where the white crust had been and looked at the bare, darkening ground for a while. She did not say anything about it when she came in. She had already put on the coffee. By the fall of 1974, all 340 acres had received at least one pass of the subsoil plow on contour. The earthworm count across the original north, 120 acres, had reached 31 per cubic foot. The soil pH in those areas had dropped from 9.4 to 8.1 through the combined effect of vetch nitrogen cycling, increased organic matter from 3 years of residue incorporation, and the leaching action of water moving through the now permeable hard pan zone. Walter planted the full 340 acres to winter wheat in October of 1974. He used a certified seed variety, TAM 101, at 22 pounds per acre. He continued the hairy vetch intercrop at 4 pounds per acre. Glenn Purdy drove past in November and saw the wheat emerging, thin, pale green lines across what had been bare cracked ground for as long as anyone in Cimarron County could remember. He stopped the truck for a long time. He drove on without getting out. At the Boise City feed store in December of 1974, someone said Walter Briggs had wheat coming up on the alkaline ground. The man behind the counter, who had lived in Boise City for 40 years and knew what the alkaline ground was, said he would believe it when he saw a harvest. Marcus Cole said that ground won't grow, somebody else offered. "It's not growing much," the first man said. "It's just green." The 1975 harvest came in August. Walter ran his 1962 John Deere 95 combine through the north 120 acres first. The wheat was not a perfect stand, irregular in places, with a low point near the old pond site still running short, but it was wheat. He ran the grain into the bed of his truck and drove it to the Boise City elevator on the first day. The elevator operator weighed the load, 4,820 pounds from 31 acres. That was a yield of 155 pounds per acre, or about 2.6 bushels per acre. Not a commercial yield by any standard of the time. The county average was 31 bushels per acre on good ground. Walter noted the number, drove back, and continued harvesting. By the end of the second week, with all 340 acres cut, he had delivered 38,400 pounds of wheat to the elevator, an average of 112 pounds per acre across the full parcel. The southern 80 acres, the last to be treated and still in their second year of recovery, had yielded only 78 pounds per acre. The north 120 acres had yielded 160 pounds per acre. The numbers were still poor by county standards, but the ground had been dead. In addition to the wheat, Walter had planted 28 acres of the flattest ground in the southern section to a vegetable rotation: dry beans, winter squash, and sweet corn in April. Following a conversation in February with a woman named Dorothea Haynes, who ran the Boise City Food Pantry out of the First Baptist Church Fellowship Hall. Haynes had mentioned, without strategy or request, that the pantry served roughly 500 families in the county, and that the most consistent shortage was fresh and dry produce. Walter had driven home and looked at the southern section and calculated the water retention in that area based on 3 years of soil probe readings. He planted it in April. The dry bean harvest in August came to 6,400 pounds. The squash came to 4,100 pounds. The sweet corn filled 47 bushels. He loaded the produce in his truck on a Tuesday morning and drove to the First Baptist Church Fellowship Hall and unloaded it at the back door. Dorothea Haynes came out and stood beside the truck and looked at what was in the bed. She did not say anything for a moment. "This is all from the Briggs land," she said finally. It was not a question. "Yes," Walter said. She looked at the dry beans. "We can't take all of this today," she said. "I'll have to call around." "I'll be back next Tuesday," Walter said. He got in the truck. He drove home and walked the north boundary and checked the fence line. On the way back, he stopped at the equipment shed and greased the subsoil plow bearings. It was the first Sunday of the month. Word moved the way it always moved in that county: at the feed store, at the elevator after church, at the diner on Main Street in Boise City, where the coffee was thin and the booths were full by 7 in the morning. By the end of August, the fact of a wheat harvest on the Briggs alkaline ground had reached most of the farming community in Cimarron County. The numbers were discussed and discounted and discussed again. 32 bushels per acre on good ground. 2.6 bushels per acre on dead ground. The math was not impressive. What reached Dr. Marcus Cole was not the yield numbers. It was the produce delivery. One of his extension colleagues had been at the First Baptist Church when Walter made his third weekly delivery in September and had called Cole that evening. Cole drove out the following Saturday morning without calling ahead. Walter was on the north section when Cole's University Extension truck came down the county road and turned into the property. Walter watched it come and kept working, pressing a soil probe into the ground at a measured point and reading the moisture gauge. He recorded the number in his notebook and moved 10 paces south and pressed the probe again. Cole got out of the truck and walked across the ground to where Walter was working. He stopped and looked at the wheat stubble on the north 120 acres. He looked at it for a long time. The stubble was sparse, but it was there, the color of straw, lying flat in the August heat, covering ground that the laminated soil survey map in his office had categorized as agriculturally unrecoverable. "I want to understand what you did," Cole said. Walter straightened from the probe and looked at him. He began at the beginning. He described Clarence's notebook, the subsoil moisture maps, the contour plow design, the earthworm counts, the leaching drain, the timing of the legume rotations. He spoke without emphasis, the way a man recites a procedure he has followed many times. Cole listened without interrupting. He bent down at one point and picked up a handful of the soil from the north section and rubbed it between his fingers. It was not good soil, but it crumbled. It did not crack. When Walter finished, Cole stood quietly for a moment. He set the soil back down. "I told you this ground couldn't respond," he said. "You did," Walter said. Cole looked out across the field. "I was wrong," he said. Flat, no particular tone to it. The admission of a man who deals in facts and had encountered a fact that required revision. Walter picked up his probe and notebook. "The southern 80 will be better by 1977, he said, "if the rains hold." He walked back toward the shed. Cole stood in the field for a while longer. Then he walked back to his truck. In November of 1975, the Oklahoma State University Department of Agronomy sent 2 graduate students to Cimarron County to take soil cores from the Briggs parcel. The students were supervised by Dr. James Whitfield, a soil scientist who had published on sodic soil rehabilitation in the Great Plains. Whitfield had been told about the Briggs land by Cole, who had submitted a formal report to the department in October. Whitfield spent a day and a half on the property. He took 42 cores across the 340 acres and cataloged the earthworm counts, pH readings, and organic matter percentages at each location. His subsequent paper, published in the Journal of Range Management in the spring of 1977, described the Briggs parcel as a case study in passive sodic soil rehabilitation through subsoil hydrological management and legume nitrogen cycling. The paper cited Clarence's notebook, which Walter had loaned to Whitfield for 3 weeks, and which Whitfield had described in a letter to Walter as among the most careful long-term observational records I have encountered in agricultural literature. Cole attended a county-wide meeting in January of 1976, at which he presented a revised extension recommendation for sodic and hardpan soils in the region, one that included subsoil contour plowing and legume intercropping as primary interventions before chemical amendment. He had spent 3 months revising his protocols. He stood at the front of the room in his blazer and presented the revision without ceremony. He acknowledged that his earlier position had not accounted for hydrological management as a mechanism. He did not make more of it than that, and the room did not ask him to. A farmer named Dale Hutchins, who had 180 acres of alkaline ground in the northwest corner of the county, came to see Walter in February of 1976 and asked if he could observe the subsoil plow in operation. Walter ran the plow along 3 contour lines on the south section while Hutchins watched. Hutchins came back in March and asked if he could borrow the plow dimensions to have one fabricated. Walter handed him the sketch from Clarence's notebook, drawn in pencil in 1952, and told him to return it when he had copied it down. By 1978, 4 other farmers in Cimarron County had built versions of the subsoil plow. Walter had looked at 2 of them. He told each builder the same thing. The shank tip angle had to be 32 degrees for the soil type in this county, not the 36 degrees in the original sketch, and the tip had to be hardened or it would fold in the first run. He declined 2 speaking invitations, one from the OSU Extension Service and one from an agricultural conference in Amarillo, citing the demands of the operation. He declined a feature story request from the Boise City News on the same grounds. He did not own a telephone at the time. 18 years passed. By 1989, the 340 acres was producing at an average of 24 bushels of wheat per acre across the full parcel. The south 80 acres had reached 18 bushels per acre in the good years. The north 120 acres had reached 31 bushels per acre, within reach of the county average for good ground operations. The vegetable rotation on the southern section continued on a rotating 20 to 30 acre basis each year, and the annual delivery to Dorothea Haynes Pantry Network, now expanded through the county and into Texas County to the east, ran between 12 and 17,000 pounds of produce depending on the season. Walter was 80 years old in the spring of 1989. He had slowed in the way a man slows when the body has kept its side of a long agreement but cannot hold the terms forever. He still walked the perimeter of the full property 3 mornings a week. He still pressed the soil probe into the ground at his 12 recorded locations and noted the moisture readings in his notebook. His son Thomas had come back to the farm in 1986, at 34, after 12 years working as a mechanic in Amarillo. Thomas had grown up watching his father work this land and had not fully understood what he was watching until he came back as an adult and walked the ground himself. He was a quiet man, in the way his father was quiet, and he had begun to see what his father saw in the soil and the contour lines and the early morning light over the north section. In the spring of 1989, Walter walked Thomas through the north section on a Tuesday morning and showed him how to read the soil moisture probe. He showed him the 12 sampling locations, which were each marked with a piece of survey flag he replaced each spring. He showed him how to compare current readings to the historical baseline recorded in the notebooks. "Why do we still run the subsoil plow on the north section?" Thomas asked. "The hardpan is broken up. The worms are established. What's the plow doing now?" Walter thought about this for a moment. He was standing at probe station 7, near the northwest corner of the north section, where the drain channel ran. "When you stop practicing something," he said, "you stop being able to do it, and you stop being able to teach it. The plow works because we know how to use it. If we put it in the shed and forget it, the next person who needs it will have to learn it from nothing." He paused. "The hard pan will come back in places. It always will. You want to know the plow when you need it, not figure it out then." Thomas nodded. He walked back to the shed with his father. Walter handed him the grease gun and pointed at the pivot bearings on the subsoil plow's hitch frame. "First Sunday of every month," Walter said. "It was your grandfather's plow. It will still be running when you're my age if you don't let it sit." Thomas took the grease gun. The plow was 41 years old. The bearings were clean and smooth. Walter walked back to the house. From the kitchen window, Ruth watched him cross the yard the way she had watched him cross it for 50 years. The slight forward lean at the shoulder, the left hand loose at his side, the right hand carrying the notebook. In the late autumn of 1993, Thomas was walking the north section after a rain, and he stopped at the place along the first contour plow line, where the wheat stubble always stood the tallest. The narrow corridor where Clarence's 1938 moisture map had shown the highest subsoil reading, the corridor that Walter had run his first plow pass along in September of 1971. Following the red paint on the fence post that Clarence had put there in 1967 so that his son would know where to begin. The ground was dark from the rain. It smelled of organic matter and root activity. Earthworms threaded up through the surface in the low spots. Thomas bent down and pressed the soil between his thumb and forefinger and released it. It crumbled. It held together just enough to show its structure before it fell. He pressed his boot against the ground. It gave. 42 years earlier, a man had stood on ground indistinguishable from concrete and decided, based on a notebook and a hand-fabricated plow and 32 years of his father's careful observation, that the ground was not dead, that it was thirsty, that the water was already there if you knew where it was and how to move it. The ground gave because someone had spent a lifetime learning how to ask it the right question. The knowledge was not in the grain yields or the soil pH reports or the university papers. It was in the notebooks, and in the hands that knew how to hold the probe, and in the bearings that were greased on the first Sunday of every month. What the land had needed was not rescue. It had needed someone who already knew it. The difference between waste and abundance in the end was a man who read his father's handwriting. If this story reached you the way it reaches people who work the land, subscribe and share it with someone who would understand why it matters.